Hi there, Allison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we are in the Finger Lakes of New York State and we're looking at the Hermann J Wiemer 2019 Magdalena Vineyard Cab Franc. Hermann Wiemer is a true pioneer in the Finger Lakes and his contribution to the industry cannot be understated. He came over from his native Germany back in the 1960s and his family actually has over 300 years of grape growing lineage in the Mosel. He bought the home farm in 1973 and then planted his first vineyards in 1977-78. And when Hermann retired in 2007, the winery was left in the very capable hands of Fred Merwarth and Oskar Bynke. Now, Fred and I spent almost an hour and a half in Magdalena Vineyard earlier this week, and there's a lot that I want to cover, so I'm just going to dive right into it. So this site was purchased by Hermann back in 1999, and the original block of Cab Franc was planted in 1999 as well. But for this wine, this is coming from a different block that was planted in 2004, and it's a 2.5-acre parcel of vines. Now, where are we in the Finger Lakes? We are on the west side of Seneca Lake, and we're on a sort of a gentle east-facing slope. We're about a mile or so away from the shoreline. And if there's one takeaway I have from my time in the Finger Lakes is how diverse all these vineyard sites are around the lakes. Everything kind of comes into play here. There's like, where is the site? What lake is it on? Is it on the east side or the west side of the lake? But there's a ton of diversity here in terms of the microclimate as well as the soils. Now, if I would say if there was a general consensus among the locals here is that the southeast side of Seneca Lake has a slightly warmer microclimate, thanks in part to the fact that these vineyards will receive the stronger afternoon sunshine from the west. Now, Magdalena Vineyard is on the west side of Seneca Lake, but it is a slightly warmer microclimate, thanks in part to two factors. Fred sort of explains to me that the moderating influence from Seneca Lake is a little bit less in this little pocket of Magdalena Vineyard. So that means that the cooling influence during the growing season isn't quite as strong, so that creates this warmer microclimate. In addition to that, we have sort of warmer air coming in from the west, and these two factors combine to kind of raise the overall vineyard temperature, which is great for red varieties like Cabernet Franc. In addition to that, this site is actually a little bit drier than many on the west side of Seneca Lake. In fact, as a point of comparison, the HJW Vineyard, which is about 10 miles south of the Magdalena Vineyard, this week alone received about 6 inches of rainfall versus Magdalena Vineyard, which only received a half an inch, which is a pretty stark contrast. This east-facing slope as well needs to be sort of stressed in terms of how important it is. This east-facing slope, it receives the morning sunshine earlier, so the vineyards get sun a little bit earlier than the western-facing slopes. And as a result, the morning sun helps to dry off the bunches, and this helps to prevent mildew and disease pressure. And the general climate of the Finger Lakes is sort of a more humid, warmer microclimate. And so this morning sun, this east-facing exposure is hugely advantageous for reducing botrytis pressure as well as other mildew pressure. Now, getting back to this block, this was planted in 2004, as I said, and it's clone 327, and it was grafted from the original plantings of Cab Franc from 1999. In addition to that, as a cool Canadian side note here, this block was actually planted by Ken Whitty, the same Whitty of the Whitty family that have 13th Street Winery in the Niagara Peninsula. Now, getting back to this block, the clusters here look very different from the original block as well, and they're not quite sure why this is, but the clusters are kind of loose, they're a little bit longer, and the berries are a little bit smaller, but looking at the clusters, you would have no idea that A, they are clone 327, or B, that they may even be Cab Franc to begin with, which is kind of interesting. Now, these rows are also planted east-west, so they change the orientation slightly, and this helps with airflow. In addition to that, they do leaf pulling just on the north side of the canopy, and Fred also told me that he waits as long as possible to do his leaf pull in order to kind of assess the vineyard conditions as far as warmer, drier, kind of wetter, cooler. If it's a warmer year, he'll leave ideally more leaves. If it's a cooler year, he'll do a little bit more in terms of leaf pulling, because at the end of the day, these leaves help to kind of cool down the overall sort of mesoclimate of the vine, and once those leaves are gone, you aren't getting them back. Now, I know what you're thinking, Allison, it's been almost 4.5 minutes and you haven't said a damn thing about soil. So what are we dealing with here? The soil is sort of this tale of two bedrocks. We have limestone and we have shale. So the limestone portion, it extends down from Lake Ontario and moves south, and it kind of stops at sort of the upper third of the Finger Lakes, and more or less kind of hugs the shoreline. And then the shale kind of follows in the lower 2/3. So where Magdalena Vineyard is situated, we are on the limestone bedrock. So the soil pH is actually high, so the soils are basic, and there's an inverse relationship between soil pH and wine wine pH, in that a higher soil pH typically results in a wine with a slightly lower pH and thus higher natural acidity. Now, the topsoils here are part of a series known as Honeoye silt loam, and these are glacially derived soils. They were formed after the last ice age. And silt is somewhat sort of in between clay and silt in terms of texture. It's not as heavy as clay, not as light as sand, somewhere in between. And we actually have a decent amount of topsoil and subsoil here, about 6 feet, and then we get to the bedrock after that. And for Cab Franc, it likes these sort of deep, well-draining soils, but these soils are also a little bit more productive. But uniquely in this particular block in Magdalena Vineyard, it actually naturally yields a little bit lower. So they don't do any sort of green harvesting or anything like that. The site naturally typically yields less than 3 tons per acre. Now, from a winemaking perspective, they do 30% whole cluster in terms of the fermentation, and then the rest of the fruit is crushed. They will also do sort of pump overs before the fermentation kicks off, and then they switch to punch downs after that. And then in terms of sort of maturation, the wine will spend some time in a combination of French and Hungarian oak, mostly neutral, about 17% or so new. Now, I will say as well, or I shouldn't forget to mention, that they are undergoing biodynamic conversion. This began in 2014, and they should have their Demeter certification hopefully by the end of this year, pandemic willing. And also, I want to give a quick shout out and express my gratitude to Fred, Oskar, Dylan, Neil, the whole crew from H J Wiemer for giving me some time this week in the middle of a Riesling conference of all things, so that I could have a little Cab Franc talk in the vineyard. So thank you all very much for that. So let's get into it. So on the nose here, it has a wonderful sort of pure fruited note, and I am getting sort of blue fruits for me, and sort of coming through as sort of a wild blueberry note, but there is a savory kind of edge to the fruit profile as opposed to sort of more fruit dominant. There's also a beautiful kind of pomegranate note as well in there, but the pyrazines do kind of take a bit of a sort of a step forward here, but they're still in balance with the fruit. So I'm getting, in terms of the earthiness, I'm getting some nice sort of cedar notes. There's a little bit of thyme here, even a little bit of tobacco as well. There's also really nice perfume to this wine as well, kind of floral, but I'm not sure what flower. It's not violets, it's something else, but there is a nice sort of floral element to the wine as well. The acidity is really, really bright, quite vivacious actually in the mouth, and it's nicely in balance with the fruit profile. Sometimes with cool climate Cab Franc, and this was a cool vintage for sure, sometimes that acidity can be a little bit too pronounced, a little bit too tart, but in this case, this is beautifully in balance with the fruit profile, in my opinion. And there's also this really wonderful kind of pure sort of sweet fruited core on the palate that was a little bit different. You know, the nose kind of leaned more savory, but there's this wonderful sort of fruit element to the center, the middle palate, which I really, really like in this wine. In addition to that, we have this wonderful spice profile in the wine. And when I was making my notes earlier, I noted paprika, not smoked paprika, but just classic paprika, which might sound a bit odd for some people, but it sort of was there for me. And there's also a really lovely kind of cinnamon stick note as well. Not like cinnamon, ground cinnamon, but cinnamon stick. So a bit more subtle than, say, ground cinnamon. Now let's talk tannins. The tannins here really, really fine and silky in the mouth, and I love how they're sort of enveloping the mouth in that way, and they finish with a nice degree of firmness and also this sort of kind of crushed velvet thing happening. There is a sense that this wine is sort of structured. It does have some good firmness to it, and it kind of sits linear on the palate, like as if it was sort of in between two railway tracks. It does have this sort of chiseled physique. There is some nice structure here, and there is a certain degree of intention and seriousness in the wine's overall demeanor. You can really get the sense that there is a very strong kind of understanding from vineyard to cellar, you know, sort of vine to glass. It sounds a bit cliche, but it really does feel like there is a deep understanding of what's happening kind of on all sort of fronts. the overall sort of persona of this wine, it has a certain sort of steadfastness, but it also has a sort of resolute kind of character to it as well. But it's not rigid. There is still this sense of ease and grace and finesse about the wine as well. And all of these kind of things combine to create this really harmonious, kind of balanced example of Cab Franc from the Finger Lakes. And as a result, I think it's really an exceptional wine and something worth seeking out. If you have a favorite Cab Franc from the Finger Lakes that perhaps is not this one, let me know what it is in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.